Okay, I am delighted to introduce Lindsay Blackwell. She is a fourth-year PhD candidate here at SI, and her dissertation work is studying the challenging and frustrating problem of online harassment with a focus on bystanders, people who are either the targets or the harassers, but who are watching and how they might decide when and how to intervene. And so this paper will be presented at ICWSM this year. It's looking at how to integrate theories of justice into responses to harassment online.
Thanks, Rita. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to present this paper. This is something I've been working on for years now with Sarita and Cliff, my advisors, and also Colin Chen, who is an MSI graduate. And the paper I'll be talking about today, as Sarita said, will be presented at ICWSM, and it investigates when online harassment is perceived as justified. Short warning, this talk is about online harassment, so there is going to be some language in here that is not pleasant or family friendly, so look out for that. So before we get started, I want to sort of set the scene. So when I use the phrase online harassment, I'm talking about a broad spectrum of abusive behaviors that are facilitated by technology. So this could mean anything from flaming or the use of personal insults or inflammatory language to insult someone, things like doxing or the broadcasting of personally identifiable information such as a phone number or address, and there's a variety of other abusive behaviors as well. So we're not just thinking about one specific behavior, but again, this broad spectrum of abusive or harmful things that technology, and especially social media sites, helps to facilitate. Already went over that. So why do people engage in harassing behaviors online? We know that online harassment happens, but why do people do this? Spoiler alert, it's not this guy. I think this is actually a Google image that I got searching for harasser. You also see this person if you search for things like hacker or like other types of harmful technology behaviors. I think there's a tendency, both in research and in the public press, to look at harassers as this sort of other category of person who is looking to hurt people, sitting in a dark basement, wearing a hoodie, like spending all day long just like flaming the hell out of people online. And that's just not the case. And we can see this really clearly when we look at stats from Pew, who found that over 40% of American adults have personally experienced online harassment, and over 2/3 of American adults have witnessed online harassment directed toward others in their feeds. Those, folks who are sitting in basements and dark hoodies are just not that productive. So we have to start looking at the possibility that everyday people online are also engaging in abusive behavior. One really salient example of this, which you may remember, is that of Justine Sacco. Justine Sacco was a PR executive who in late 2013 tweeted the following: "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white." Pretty blatantly racist. Justine later claimed that this was a joke, which she tweeted out to her small number of followers. I think she had 200 or 300 followers at the time. But someone got a hold of this tweet and forwarded it to Sam Biddle, who was a reporter for Gawker, or was a reporter for Gawker. He published a story, and within the next hour, it was covered by BuzzFeed, it was on CNN, it was on Fox. My mom was calling me about this tweet. It was everywhere. And Justine, of course, was on her way to South Africa, in flight, with no obvious internet access, or she probably would have noticed what was going on. During the course of that 9-hour flight, the hashtag #HasJustineLandedYet became the #1 globally trending topic on Twitter. There were so many death threats being levied both at Justine and her family members, who had all been doxxed, that they had to have a police presence at the South African airport when she landed, and she'd been fired from her very prestigious job with IAC. These are just some of the headlines from that incident. IAC fired her, of course. BuzzFeed, this is how a woman's offensive tweet became the world's top story, stories about the hashtag, etc. And when you look at tweets that are still online, these are screenshots that I took probably last year now, some of these things still exist. They have not been removed from Twitter, and you can see people calling her ignorant, telling her to kill herself. I apologize in advance, but go fuck yourself, you racist, scabby little rat of a whore. This is just sort of the types of things that everyday people were sending to Justine in response to that racist tweet that she'd sent. And you can see from these avatars and usernames, if you're able to see them, that these are not people relying on anonymity or pseudonymity exclusively. Some people do have their full names attached to these accounts. They have avatars that represent their face. This is not consistent with the sort of image of a harasser that we have in our minds. This slide is just a sample of many, many tweets that claimed that Justine Sacco deserved everything that was coming her way. So you deserve every bit of backlash and more. A racist tweet about Africa, now she's quit Twitter, lost her job, and fucked up her future. White bitch, you deserve this. This was a very persistent narrative that Justine had brought this on herself by saying something racist. Another example that I'll give quickly is that of David Levitt. This was much more recent, so this happened last spring following the bombings at Manchester Arena during Ariana Grande's concert. David Levitt is a journalist, I believe he's based out of Boston, and he tweeted, he has a verified account, he has thousands of followers, if not hundreds of thousands of followers, and he tweeted, multiple confirmed fatalities at Manchester Arena. The last time I listened to Ariana Grande, I almost died too. Pretty immediately, we see the same types of tweets. I'm just going to go through these really quickly, that we saw during Justine's incident. You just can't put the shovel down. You deserve the shitstorm. You seem hell-bent on stirring up. This C-word doesn't deserve to be called a human. He's the lowest of low, etc., etc. Give us back the 8-year-old girl who had passed away in these bombings, and we will give you the scumbag David Levitt. He doesn't deserve life. And again, we see the same type of thing happening following the white supremacist rallies in Charlottesville last year. Images of the crowd of white supremacists who had gathered were shared online, and attempts to identify each member who had been photographed were made. There was an account on Twitter that was exclusively just sharing names and addresses and family members' names of people that they were able to identify or that they had thought they'd identified. There were a couple mistakes made. This particular person was identified as a UNR student in Nevada, and there was tons of press directed his way. He ended up speaking to the press and sort of defending his decision to be at the rally, claiming ignorance, claiming that he believed in some of the platforms that these alt-right groups support, but not all. This is the account I mentioned, Yes, You're Racist, which was leading the charge in doxing many of the attendees, and this is the tweet where they identified Peter and also linked to his Facebook profile and other web presence. So, coming back to that question I asked, why do people engage in harassing behaviors online? From the examples I've just showed, I think one reason, not the reason, but one reason people engage in these behaviors is as a form of social sanctioning. A controversial form, certainly, but what we're seeing is that people are using the same types of behaviors that we classify as online harassment in an attempt to sanction what they perceive as norm violations online. So you said something racist, I dox you. You said something awful about bombing victims, I am calling for you to be fired for your job, etc. So in this work, we draw from theories of criminal justice to help explain why this is happening. One model of justice that is very pervasive in Western societies, basically the entire US criminal system is built on this, is retributive justice. So this is a very biblical eye for an eye sort of a model. If you are a proponent of retributive justice, and this is a belief that you will personally, you would believe, for example, that someone who commits murder deserves the death penalty. So it's an eye for an eye, right? It's about proportional punishment for wrongdoings. So in this model, there is some type of criminal offense. A proportionate punishment is served and or issued, and then the culmination of that is that justice is served. So without that proportional punishment, we don't get to justice. What we propose in the paper is retributive harassment. So the use of harassing behaviors online to sanction norm violations in a similar type of model. So a user will see a norm violation, they will issue a sanction, and then in their minds they perceive that as justice having been served. So Justine Sacco says something racist, I tell her to kill herself, I feel like that is justice. We tested this empirically with an experiment. So we had two experiments that I'll explain today. The first was using retributive priming. So we hypothesized that exposure to a retributive prime, and I'll explain what that means in a second, would increase the belief that a transgression is justified, deserved, and appropriate. And the second hypothesis we had is that that effect would be stronger for people who personally believe in retributive models of justice over more utilitarian or other approaches. So we ran a 3:1 between subjects experiment. We had a control group where no prime was issued. We had a low retributive prime and a high retributive condition. And we produced the following tweet, again, so sorry for the language. This is a fake, again, manufactured tweet. These accounts do not exist. Well, they exist, but only because I created them so that no one else could claim them. This is a woman named Amy tweeting to a woman named Sarah, "You're such a cunt, kill yourself." We used names and avatars that would roughly represent white women to mitigate for any effects of race and gender. For the simple pilot experiment, we didn't want to have, for example, a man harassing a woman or vice versa, because that would complicate the effects we were seeing. And then this is how this played out in the experimental condition. So in the control, participants were only shown that harassing tweet, no other context. In the low retributive condition, before they saw the tweet, participants were told that Sarah, the woman being harassed, had stolen $100 from an elderly couple. And in the high retributive condition, participants were told that Sarah had stolen $10,000 from an elderly couple, and then they were shown the same tweet. Our dependent variables, as I said, were how appropriate is what Amy said to Sarah on a 7-point Likert scale, how deserved is what Amy said to Sarah, and how justified is what Amy said to Sarah. We also issued participants the punishment orientation questionnaire, which comes from Susan Yamamoto's work in 2014. It is the first validated scale that looks to measure perceptions of justice as an individual difference variable. So typically in criminal justice literature and in criminal psychology, when people talk about justice, it's typically about a specific justice system or a specific crime. This scale tries to show how individual people conceptualize justice. So for example, items from the retributive scale, the harsh retributive scale, which is the scale that we used, you would rate on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree with a set of statements. So for example, even if society would not benefit at all from punishing a guilty person, he should still be punished because he deserves it. That's a very retributive sort of notion. Criminals are in prison because they brought it on themselves, same thing. So people who favor retributive justice believe that criminal offenders deserve proportional punishments. So we found partial support for our first hypothesis. We found that online harassment of an offender, so someone who's committed some offense, is justified and deserved, but not appropriate. We also found support for our second hypothesis. People who favor retributive justice find online harassment of an offender more deserved and more justified than people who don't favor that approach. We also asked participants a few open-ended responses, open-ended questions. We asked them, if you saw this online, how would you feel? And I have a few quotes to sort of illustrate the feelings that these examples brought out. This participant said, "I think it's wrong to tell people to kill themselves, obviously, but who steals $10,000 from an elderly couple? She should be told in no uncertain terms what a horrible person she is." Another participant said, "At least some kids still have morals these days, even if they have foul mouths." Another participant said, "Sounds like Sarah's an asshole, but yelling garbage into the void does nothing to help the wrong." So this is an example of a participant who did not view this transgression as justified or appropriate. They still believe that online harassment was not okay, even if the person being harassed had done something wrong. We asked participants if they saw this online, what, if anything, would they do? Would they intervene? Would they report it to a platform, etc.? One participant said that they had honestly felt so desensitized to responses like Amy's. They felt like instances like this were everywhere and that harassment was becoming normalized online. They said, "I wouldn't feel much of anything other than rolling my eyes and moving on." And this was a very common response. People felt that this was a very normal thing and that they wouldn't really intervene unless they knew Amy or Sarah had some sort of stake. The second study that I'll explain looks at bystander intervention. So we built upon the first experiment, but we introduced the presence of a bystander. So this is really tough to see and I'll zoom in, but basically what you've got is a very similar interaction, again between Amy and Sarah. In this example, Amy is telling Sarah, "You're a fucking cunt, do the world a favor and kill yourself." So a slightly more decorative version of the first offense. And then underneath, you have a number of replies. And what we did was introduce conforming replies, so people who were supporting this specific interaction. So the first person says, "Totally on point." Some people deserve even worse than that, like the person, Sarah, who had stolen money. someone saying, well said, LMAO, you've won the internet today, so true, etc. So these are conforming responses. In one condition, in addition to those conforming responses, we added a bystander who was saying, no, this is not okay. So this bystander, again, Jenny, we used names and avatars that would evoke white women to mitigate effects of race and gender. Jenny says, that's so mean. Whatever she did, no one deserves to be treated like this. And that was just for the bystander intervention condition listed in the conforming replies. And we did find, hopefully, I never have good news to share, this is so exciting. We did find that bystander intervention reduces the perception of retributive harassment as justified or deserved. So again, we have that same support of retributive harassment as deserved and justified, but for participants who were shown this interaction in the midst of other conforming replies, they rated that, that interaction as less justified and less deserved. So where do we go from here? What does this tell us? The first thing I want to focus on is, why does online matter to this narrative? So retribution is something that's core to the human experience. The act of social sanctioning is something that we all engage in every day in various ways. But we argue in the paper that online environments have specific affordances that could exacerbate this effect. So affordances such as visibility, persistence, and archivability, the same things that made it possible for people to screenshot Justine Sacco's racist tweet and circulate it well after she deleted it. Those types of affordances might encourage or exacerbate this retributive harassment. And the last item that we draw from in the discussion is restorative justice, which is an emerging alternative to the Western retributive-based model of justice, and it seeks to achieve the restoration of justice through a shared understanding between victims, offenders, and the communities. So where retributive justice is focused on punishing an offender, you committed a crime, now you will be punished. Restorative justice really tries to rehabilitate offenders back into their communities successfully so that they're not committing future offenses, and so that the community feels comfortable, the victim feels comfortable, and everyone has a say in the process. So one direction for future work is to explore ways that we can integrate restorative principles into our online community. So having spaces where people who are offended have an opportunity to voice their offense, giving offenders the opportunity to apologize and make amends, which is not a part of offline retributive justice systems, and creating spaces where communities of people can come together to express their feelings and concerns in ways that don't ultimately create more harm. That's all I've got. Happy to take questions, and the slides are available. Yeah, Sherry G.
So this is really great work.
Thank you.
There's a couple of points that you may want to consider. One is that I really like your use of restorative justice and retributive justice. But those two conceptions are individual focus. Mm-hmm. One possible future direction might be to look at like Rawls' notion of veil of ignorance in justice, mm-hmm. where your acts are driven by an ignorance to what the consequence to the larger, like, so you can behave in a certain way because you're inured from the consequence to whoever it is out there. So that's just one space to look at for the future, other than what you have in much more personalized forms of justice rather than abstracted forms of justice.
Yeah, I love that suggestion.
The second point is there's this on the interventionist piece, mm-hmm. is that again I'll probably like it'll come back to me like what is this specific person who did this work, but there is this notion of the extremity of reaction is less scary than the confirmation of reaction, which is the criminal justice concept that if imposing death penalty is less likely to deter crime, mm-hmm. than the certainty that you will get caught, irrespective of how small so Singapore has less crime because you definitely get caught, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So by that in that conception of justice, the person who intervenes, how they perceive they will be attacked, mm-hmm. becomes an important variable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, deterrence theory, there are a lot of theorists who work in that space. I think that's a great space to look. When we're talking about people engaging in harassing behaviors as a type of sanctioning, I don't think there currently are many consequences for engaging in that because platforms like Facebook and Twitter struggle to get harassment off of their platforms and to moderated scale. So in terms of deterrence, there isn't a lot of deterrent for me to go in and send a tweet like that to Justine Sacco. So I think that's a really interesting.
No. I meant yes, that. But I also meant like for the person who intervenes and says, "I'm going to defend Justine Sacco."
Yes.
For that person, what is the consequence? And
I will get back to you once my dissertation is written. Other questions? Yeah.
This is more of a presentation thing. I loved your talk.
Thank you.
But since you're conducting surveys, maybe mention like the effect size or number of people who take
Okay.
it or something.
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, also really appreciate this research.
Thanks.
So I have a question about the Yamamoto, the use of it's the punishment orientation questionnaire, right?
Yes.
And it's like 18 Likert scale questions,
Yeah.
right? So I know somebody at Ford that tried to design a study around that, and I remember them saying that they got a really low completion rate because it was so many Likert scale questions. I was just curious, did you?
We did not.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't have that problem, but we also incentivized participants. They got a $2 Amazon gift card for participating, so that could be part of it. And the rest of the survey was relatively short to compensate for that 18-item measure. But I'd be interested to know who that was and
Yeah.
find out what they're doing with
Cool.
it.
Yeah, we can talk offline. Cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in your study that you tried to have all of the Twitter representatives be the same person. So I noticed like in the examples that you initially started with, a lot of them were like race-based or gender-based. Do you have any examples that are not like that to like, I guess, further bring those two together?
Yeah, so that would be where we'd want to take this in the next step, is having a set of experiments that play more with both the identities of the person harassing and the person being harassed, but also playing with the context of that crime. The reason that for this study we used theft was because it was easy to say numerically this is objectively lower of an offense than a $10,000 robbery. Like $100 is objectively lower. We did play around a lot with vignettes that would capture more of that, like racism, sexism, the things that people often react to in this way online, but it was very difficult to say, you know, this racist comment is low and this racist comment is high, but it's something we definitely like to look at in the future. Yeah, try to keep.
Did you also find something gendered because the use of cunt? Was there something in the people who reacted?
Yeah, so we coded the open-ended responses, and there weren't many people who commented specifically on that word or in the gendered use of that word. There weren't any noticeable effects in terms of the gender of the participants statistically. And also I've noticed, I didn't actually notice this before, but in some of the screenshots I took from the David Levitt responses, people were calling him the C word, which I thought was interesting. So that's something that I'm interested in, but that didn't really emerge in these results, no. Yeah, Sean.
Can you speak to, I know you were saying you used a white woman as like a mitigating, normalizing factor. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'd say it wasn't necessarily intended to be normalizing as much as it was to reduce the potential effects of race and gender as much as we could. So if we had a man issuing a harassing sanction to a woman, that would be received differently, should be received differently by different groups of people, and that would introduce other mitigating factors that we didn't want to introduce. And the same would be true if we varied the races. So we tried to keep it as consistent as we could. Another possible approach would of course be using pseudonyms and avatars that don't have any personal information, but we were concerned that people would perceive that as not as serious if the interaction was occurring between, you know, two people with egg avatars who just had an anonymous or anonymized pseudonym. Cool, thank you so much.